It's great to be catching up with Matt Dalgleish from Thomas Elder Markets. Matt, how are you travelling?
I'm good, thanks, Ricky. Thanks for having me on again.
Not a problem. Look, checking in with where markets have been over the last week or so, it looks like across both cattle and sheep, a slight uplift in the indicators from Meat and Livestock Australia.
Look, the mutton price, I guess, is the main one that's kind of climbed a bit over the last week. We're seeing a reasonable rally there, and East Coast mutton's now sitting about 60 cents a kilo carcass weight, so that's a reasonably good price, especially considering we've been seeing some good flow of mutton at the sale yard. Quite high numbers really coming through for this time of the year. So that's a good sign, really, when you see high supply and the price moving up. Just generally, that's reflective of good demand. And cattle prices actually, they're slightly softer this week, but not by a lot. So,
yeah, we're still hovering around that 1,100 mark that you tell someone 18 months ago that's where we'd be at. They would have been pinching themselves.
Yeah, that's right. They're still historically very high levels. Yeah, whether it's kind of sheep and lamb or cattle, they're all pretty good for the producer.
There's been a lot of conversation, and naturally during a federal election, I guess these things come to the fore about biosecurity and concerns about Indonesia, foot and mouth disease, and lumpy skin disease. But that wouldn't really feed into the markets in the immediate sense, at least anyway. We don't take supply from there very much. If anything, they might have more demand if they've got problems on their home front.
Yeah, that's right. It's a concern from a biosecurity perspective. If it gets in, then we could start to see some significant price impacts and cost to the producer here if it gets in. It would be incredibly damaging to our reputation in terms of our export markets as well. So that would have some significant kind of impact. The estimate for something like mouth disease, it ranges, if it's a small incursion and relatively isolated and a short-term kind of thing, we're looking at about a $7 to $10 billion cost. But if it's a longer process that impacts a broader area and becomes somewhat endemic, that could extend out to a $50 billion or $100 billion cost, is what some commentators are looking at in terms of cost to the sector. So it's quite a concern at the moment. But as it stands now, it's still over in Indonesia. So
that's right.
Watching closely.
Yeah, James Jackson, President of New South Wales Farmers, threw the $100 billion figure at us. But again, the markets aren't necessarily going to react to that at this stage, but they might make some movements if there are outbreaks or detections in different parts of Australia.
Yeah, that's right. And the concern is as well is that we have got a tracing methodology for cattle and sheep. The cattle, of course, it's mandatory to have electronic ear tags in all cattle across the country, but the sheep and lamb side is such that some states are still relying on what they call a mob-based movement, and it's not per animal, so it's a bit more tricky to trace that. It's still going to be done, but it takes a bit more time to trace animals. So if it was to get into the country and spread around, it could put our biosecurity and tracking and tracing measures to the test, and that's the real key.
Now, I notice, Matt, you keep a close eye on export markets, what's opening up or where we're getting a bit more of a foot in the door in other countries. Has there been any developments on that front since the last time we spoke?
I think the last time we spoke, we talked about those numbers for April, and that was kind of for beef. It was slightly softer, but April we do see a softening anyway. But it was softer than normal, so it'll be next month will be the next bit of figures for that. And the sheep and lamb markets, in terms of export markets, are still tracking relatively well, with the US being a strong consumer of sheep meat from Australia, and that's continued through April. But we've got to wait until the start of the next month before we see how May has been tracking.
And also, I guess we've been talking and looking at some of on the grains front at what looks like a pretty tough year again coming through for the Northern Hemisphere and American, Canadian and US growers on the growing front. Does that start feeding into expectations going forward into the livestock front with our competition from the US and Canada?
Look, there's been ongoing concerns. Obviously, the first stage was that Russia-Ukraine conflict, which caused grain prices globally to spike. But as you said, we've seen some issues in Northern Hemisphere, both in France and in Canada and North America, with dry conditions. So that's kind of given an extra kick. And actually, just recently, there was some suggestion that India might be able to export some of their grain, but they've also now been impacted by heat waves. So they've now turned around from saying they were going to export to saying they're not letting any out if they can help it. So that's caused grain prices to go further higher in a global sense, and that's also flowed through to the domestic price. So in the last week, we've seen the domestic price of grain lift about $80 a tonne. So that does start to cause issues for those industries in livestock like chicken production, pig production, egg production. They're all kind of heavily reliant on the grain side of things, and obviously the feedlots as well for beef. So it's concerning for those producers that rely on the grain as an input. So we've just got to see how that plays out, because they're already getting a cost price squeeze from the likes of fuel costs and fertiliser costs and labour costs. It's all going up on a cost perspective. So it's feeding through to the need for higher prices for these animals to be able to make margins work.
All right, Matt, thanks very much for keeping that weather eye on things for us. If anyone wants any more information, what's the website they can go to?
It's www.thomasaldermarkets.com.au.
All right, thanks again, Matt. We'll catch you again soon.
Cheers, Ricky.